And welcome back. So you can see we're in the process of getting the dash from the 2010 put into the 2012, and so far so good. Everything fits, everything lines up. It pretty much has the everything we found so far. It has the exact same bolt patterns, same locations, even as the old dash we took out. You can see that we've got the newer glove box in, which included a little door, that little spring-loaded door at the top that wasn't in the 2012. So we've got all that bolted in. Just remember that when you're putting this dash in, remember to do two things. One, hook your airbag wiring back up to the airbag and the dash on the passenger side before you start tightening everything down. Otherwise, you'll be taking the dash loose again to get to those connectors. And on the top center connector, make sure you pull that one through, because that one hooks up to your sun sensor. If you have it, that's the one that controls your automatic headlights and things of that nature. And of course, also the lights that come on after dusk, so on and so forth. So as you can see here, we're just getting all the wiring pulled through where it needs to go in the dash, and so far everything's lining up just like it did on the old dash. Again, the only difference is this one's 2 years older, but looks, in my opinion, a lot better, because it is a slightly upgraded dash, because it's got the, you know, like I said, we pointed out before, you know, you can see visible stitching in this one. It doesn't look as much like just straight up plastic as the other dash did. But we're going to continue to work on this one, get all our bolts in place. If you remember from the 2009 video when we did this, again, it's just like I said, it's a lot of 7mm bolts. And if I remember correctly, the 2 bolts for the airbag, remember to put also the 2 bolts that hold the airbag to the main dash frame. Make sure to put those in before you put that top glove box assembly back in. Otherwise, you'll be taking the top of the glove box assembly back out. And I believe those are a 10mm, if I remember correctly. But everything else so far that you take out, other than those 2 bolts again that secure that airbag to its mounting bracket in the frame, everything else so far has been a 17mm. And there are 2 other bolts. I'll have to find them in the bag here. Remember, they go in the very front of the dash, and those little square openings, and you kind of have to have a swivel in order to get the right angle on it to get the socket to line up to tighten those up. But we're going to continue on getting all the 7mm bolts back in place. We also need to tighten our steering wheel back up. We just got the bolts in there hand tight just to hold the steering wheel in place. It is a lot easier to get the cluster assembly out with the steering wheel a little bit loose and drop down, and it's definitely easier to get the dash in and out of here with the steering wheel just completely lowered as much as you can get it, just to get it out of the way of, you know, the side shifter and turn signal lever and things of that nature. But we're going to continue putting on bolts in this, and I'll bring you back in a bit. One moment. And welcome back. So we're still in the process of putting the dash and everything out of this, our parts RAM, or 2010 RAM and our 2012, but there were some little inserts I needed, and these are for the bolts that hold the front bracket for the console in. And you can see I got one of them out, but I did discover that at least on this 2010, those inserts, well, because they're not on the 2012, which is why we need them. So this bracket is there, but not these inserts. But we did discover that you can put a flat blade screwdriver into this insert and then pry it out like that, and there we go. Now we got our inserts that we can just bend back in a little bit and then reinsert into our 2012. It was either this, or we'll have to come up with a, you know, custom nut and bolt, because that's what we end up with. That's what we got in the 2012 right now. It's just the opening for the insert. So I'm going to go ahead and get these installed and bring you back. One moment. And welcome back. So you can see we've got our bezel, at least our front center dash bezel here. Do a little bit of work to it before we install it in the truck. And one of the things we're going to do is replace this lower bank of switches, because that one right there feels a little spongy, a little odd. Doesn't feel quite right. So we just went to eBay and picked up another, what is called lower switch bank, for this vintage Ram. The other thing we're going to do is pop this control out for the four-wheel drive, since the truck we're installing this into doesn't have four-wheel drive, and we kind of need to put this back into the 2012 to make sure that we maintain its drivability, just so again we can move it around. So what we're going to do is take the original front trim, and you can see the differences between the two. So this is what came out of the 2012, that's what's going in, and primarily the difference is down here at the bottom where it meets up with the center console. You can see that shape in there, plus two mounting points here that you don't see on this one. So what we're going to do is pop this little coin tray out of this side of it, which these can come out independently of the vent. The 115 volt outlet, however, on this front panel trim, this won't come out of here. In other words, this whole square piece won't come out to where you could potentially just put this piece in. Nor does it look like, you know, this vent assembly would pop out in one piece. This is all molded into the plastic. Like, you can get this vent out and you could get the switch out, but you'd still be left with this behind it. Now you might be able to come in here with a Dremel and Dremel this piece out, and then snap just a little coin tray or another one of these little dishes into there. But to be honest with you, I'm just going to leave this in place, even though it won't be functional. It'll still just be there, because again, there's no way to pop this out and replace it with one of these. But at least on the four-wheel drive side of it, we can pop this selector switch out and replace it with one of these dishes. So I'm going to go work on that, and I'll bring you back in a moment. Actually, I can show that to you. If you look on the back of this, these little trays or cubby holes, or however you want to call them, there's just a couple of releases on top that you can push into. See? And they come out like that. And then all we got to do is pull this control out, because again, we don't need it, because the truck it's going into doesn't have four-wheel drive. And just push in on the tabs. There we go. Oh, we had one side of it, just maintaining some pressure down on it as I squeeze these tabs inward. There we go. So there's the four-wheel drive selector switch, of which we will then just take the little cup we popped out earlier. The release tabs go towards the top. There we go. Those pop in. So now we got a little coin holder in there, a little cubby hole, however you want to call it. Instead of having a selector switch, we're not going to use. These models of trim are pretty interchangeable as far as pieces. Now, another thing I considered doing was pulling this piece here out and using the one that came out of the 2012, you know, thinking that this was actually 2 years older, because I wanted to keep the one that was 2 years newer. But if you look at the date on this, this has been replaced before. This says 10/5 of 2015. The one that's in the 2012 says that it is 2/3 of 2008. So what we're going to do is we're just going to go ahead and leave our HVAC control module exactly the way it is, since this one is newer. And then, like I said, we'll just got 4 Phillips screws here. We're just going to take this lower switch bank out and replace it with the one we got off eBay, again, because that ventilated switch button for the passenger side on this one seems a little bit wore out. So I'm going to go ahead and continue to work on this and bring you back. One moment. And welcome back. So just continuing to work on our dash here. We've got our instrument cluster reinstalled at this point. Steering wheel is tightened back up and secured. Key switch has been added back in. Trailer brake controller, even though we'll probably never use it, it's been added back in as well, right there. And yes, even though this dash came out of a vehicle that didn't have a trailer brake controller, it still had the access port to install it onto this one. It's just that if you don't have that control module on the left hand side there, they just put like a little cubby hole, very similar to, you know, something like this, just to block off the port. This was the trim panel you saw us working on earlier, in which we took the four-wheel drive selector switch out, replaced it with just a closed off box. We replaced the heated seat and ventilated seat selector switches. Now you'll notice this guy here, because this came out of our 2010, which had an inverter. I didn't switch this out with the switches that came out of the 2012 here. Even though this button will be here and basically not be active and not really do anything inside of our 2012, I figured I'd go ahead and leave it, because it, you know, kind of goes along with that. I mean, if you wanted to, you could take this upper switch bank off of the 2012 faceplate and add it into this one. It would still fit, it would still work fine, but even though this one's going to have a switch on it that basically doesn't do anything for the time being, it'll still work for the tow haul, the traction control, and the hazard. Besides, if we keep this bank of switches, then in the future, if we want to look into adding the inverter functionality, then, you know, the button, the enable on and off button for that's already there. So this is the other thing I wanted to show you, was that just like on the dash we took out of the 2012 Ram here, it does have little ports here on the side where, if, like for instance, the inverter connection, this is your 115 volt output of your inverter. If you don't have the inverter option, you can see they have a cutout in the dash, and all they do is just do something like this, and they just clip the plug into that holder just so it secures it. Same thing with the four-wheel drive connector. This dash is in this 2012, even though it's two-wheel drive, is pre-wired for a four-wheel drive selector. So if you had, you know, I guess if you wanted to go through the expense and trouble of adding a transfer case in the rear and a front diff and all the other associated bits and pieces, you know, you potentially could enable it. But you see, all they do is, since it's not an option on this particular truck, is once again they just take the connector like this and then just plug it into that little holder on the dash, and it just secures that connector. So even though the dash came out of the 2010, which has four-wheel drive, you can see the molding is still the same between the two. But I'm going to go ahead and plug this one in to its receptacle here, even though it won't be used. I'm going to plug it in anyway. But you can also see that we've got our front mounting bracket for our console installed. That was the earlier video you saw us pull those rectangular looking nuts out of the holder in our 2010 and just popped it in our 2012 and secured it. So far so good. No issues at all. We got a few more fasteners to put in here yet to get everything secured, but everything is fit, everything lined up. Taking this out of a 2010 and putting it into 2012, all the fasteners are the same. Nothing's had to be modified thus far, so it's exactly what we thought it would be. It's a pretty, you know, straightforward drop-in swap of an upgrade. And even though this came out of this trim piece came out of one that didn't have a column shifter, you can see it clears the column shifter and, you know, doesn't bother it one bit. So we're going to work on getting our center bezel reinstalled at this point. That's just the electrical connections that you see here. And yes, the electrical connection, even though this truck didn't originally have heated seats, the power and the LIN bus connection, which is that one right there, should just be a 3-pin connector with 3 pins used on it. For this module, the lower switch bank module was already pre-wired into the dash and literally plugged into just a dummy plate on the back of the 2012 dash trim. So again, I guess easier way of saying it is that the wiring and the provisioning to plug in that lower switch bank was already inside the dash on this vehicle. So we're going to work on, and we also took the radio from our 2010. Even though it's a bit older, this radio actually looks to be a slight bit of an upgrade than what was in our 2012. Mainly you see the push to talk button here, so you can give it commands, and of course the phone button here. Now that kind of leads it to maybe insinuate that it has Bluetooth functionality to be able to connect to the phone. I did look all over the behind the dash of the 2010, and normally if a Ram 1500 is going to have a Bluetooth module, usually it's right here on the passenger side, just kind of clipped in place, and I can't find it on the 2010 out there, even though it does have the button here. So sometimes what they do in these Rams is they'll put this radio, and now this is an older radio. You typically won't see these radios much anymore on the newer 4th gen models. You'll see more of a touchscreen driven radio, but a lot of times in some of the trim levels they'll put this in as an option, even though the truck isn't capable of Bluetooth, and it takes an additional external module you have to add to the system to enable that button to actually work. It basically means it's like cell phone ready or Bluetooth ready, even though you have to buy like a $250 kit to add to the radio to get that. So since this looked like, or appears to be, a slightly upgraded base model of a radio, we're going to see if the truck is happy with us just, you know, pulling that out and adding it to this 2012. I don't think these basic radios are VIN locked. There shouldn't be any kind of activation code that I'm aware of, but if there is, I'll let you know whether we have to go back and install the original. Now there's a place online called Infotainment that sells the upgraded radios that are meant to be basically their factory upgraded radios. So they maintain all your steering wheel controls, all the integrations into the truck. And what we can do on this one, since we're in that 2009 to 2012-ish range on this one, we can get actually the same premium radio that was in the 2009 you saw us working on, that has the touch screen. We can get the upper end radio for this vintage of a 1500, and they'll pre-program it, send it to us, and it's just kind of a drop-in install. And that one does have the ability to, I think we may still have to add the Bluetooth kit to that one, I'm not entirely sure, but so basically I guess what I'm trying to say is at some point in the future we're going to upgrade the stereo in this truck, but I would prefer to keep it with some type of factory OEM radio. That way all the integration and all the steering wheel controls and everything continues to function, and we don't put like an aftermarket in here and lose the ability for the steering wheel controls and some of the other integrations. But that's what that sits. We're going to continue to work on getting this center trim piece in, and I'll bring you back. Thank you much. And welcome back. So you can see we got our center trim piece in. At this point, we just need to put the top plastic piece in and put the screws in it. Went ahead and put our 2 bolts and our 1 smaller bolt on this side that rests up inside these kind of hard and tight to get to because you're right up against the windshield. But remember, so far in all 3 of the 4th gen 2009, the 12s that I've taken the dash out of them, they've been the same. So you've got these 2 bolts up here underneath these cubby holes, and on this driver's side you also have not only the main bolt that holds it in, but you got a 7mm that's a little higher up. That 7mm could be a little tricky. You definitely need a deep well in order to reach it, but thankfully these holes are angled enough where you can get the main bolt and that smaller bolt on this side to kind of drop in place. And then what you can do on that 7mm bolt, the smaller one that I found, which makes it easier, is to just take the socket by itself, the deep well by itself, spin that bolt in by hand until you get enough clearance between the top of the socket and the windshield to now get your 1/4-inch ratchet in there, and then you can finish tightening it up. For those bigger bolts, I think I've said this before in some other videos, but sometimes you just need all the extensions in a day. So running so they're 10mm bolts, the bigger bolts. Put that on a swivel, give yourself some nice long extensions so you can clear the windshield. It gets the ratchet out to about here or so you're not banging against the windshield, and you can get those bolts out. Like I said, they come out and they go back in fairly easily, thankfully, because those captions in here are nice and angled where you can kind of do it by feel. Just drop the bolt in place, you'll feel where it hits, and you can thread it by hand a little bit, and then once you know you've got it thread and started, you can finish it up with a ratchet. So again, we're just continuing to kind of put little bits and pieces of this dash back together. I need to put the sun sensor back in the center, and then we can put our two side pillar pieces back on, because that will go ahead and wrap them up. So I'm going to continue on, and I'll bring you back in a bit. Thank you much. And welcome back. So went ahead and got our speakers reinstalled along with their grills, or their cover grills. As you can see here, went ahead and got our side handles reinstalled. Also our sun sensor is snapped back into place, and went ahead and put our side trim, as you can see here, pop those back into place. So the only thing that hasn't been done as far as what would be considered dash is just the lower panel below the steering wheel that you can see here. I'm going to leave that off deliberately in case we run into a wiring issue that we need to troubleshoot. That'll probably be one of the few things that we do once we go to test everything out. And if everything tests okay, then I'll go ahead and put this lower panel back on. But we are to the point, as you can see here, that in order to put the center console in and finish up the rest of the dash install, we have to have the carpet in first. And of course, once we have the carpet in, then we can start putting our kick panels, or lower kick shield, or kick plates, lower kick plates, and all of our trim and everything can start going back in. We can start getting seats installed and so on and so forth. So as you can see, the dash install in and of itself, about 99% of it, I should say 95% of it at this point, is in. Looks good. It's in my opinion, a quite worthwhile upgrade compared to what was in here before. So as you can see, it is in. It fits, as I said earlier, everything lined up. They're used the exact same bolts, the exact same number of bolts, so on and so forth. And as we covered earlier, the only difference is this center trim is meant to meet up with a center console. That's why it stops here, has this little indentation, some mounting holes, and of course went ahead and installed our front bracket. Once we have our carpet installed, then we can go ahead and get our rear bracket installed in our hardware here. And then of course, as you saw in the previous video, once we have our console installed, we can then start buttoning up the last of the electrical that we need prior to then putting the seats in. So what we are going to be waiting for at this point is waiting for some more good weather to come in. It's supposed to rain tomorrow, unfortunately. And one of the things we want to do is get the replacement carpet out of the box that was shipped in, get it laid out into some sunlight, so that way it can kind of stretch and soften up and be a little easier to work with. So I'm going to cut the video at this point, as this does cover the blunt of the dash install. And of course, we'll finish up the rest of putting the sun visors and all that back in for the headliner, once we do the rest of the interior. So this may be a little bit shorter video than what we normally put out, but like I said, it was more of a, so this is more of a kind of a highlight reel of installing the dash. I've got more in-depth videos, especially on the 2009 TRX4 that we did last season. It's a little bit more in-depth on installing it, but again, really the only difference here is just that center console, and really again, that only major difference is just that lower piece, because it's going to have that console, that center console, if you remember, sets up about this high and comes all the way across. So with that being said, if you have not subscribed already, please consider to do so. For those of you who have, thank you very much. We are again knocking right on that door of about 1,500 subscribers, and thank you to all who have helped that make that possible. And as you can see, we've gotten a lot of work done, but we got a lot more to go yet. And I think it's going to look, I think it'll look pretty nice in here once we get the carpet and the refinished seats and kind of finish buttoning this interior up. But so far, so good. And I'll catch you on the next one. Thank you much. Bye.